Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth's life was troubled from the moment she was born. Her father, King Henry XIV, changed the path of England's history in order to marry Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother. On September 7, 1553, in Greenwich Palace, Anne gave birth to Elizabeth, a daughter instead of a son. She was named after both of her grandmothers, Elizabeth Howard and Elizabeth of York. Elizabeth spent her first few weeks in the royal nurseries. At 3 months old, she was given her own household, the Palace of Hatfield in Hertfordshire. When Anne gave birth to a son a few years later, he was stillborn. At that point, Henry had begun to grow tired of her, so Henry decided to get an execution warrant signed, and on May 19, 1536, Anne was beheaded on the Tower Green. Henry then remarried Jane Seymour and was eagerly awaiting the son he hoped she was carrying. Parliament then passed a new Act of Succession declaring that the children of this marriage would be Henry's heirs. Mary, Elizabeth's older half-sister, lost her position as a legitimate heir when Henry annulled his marriage to Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon.
Elizabeth became Queen of England on November 17, 1558, at the age of 25. She was crowned on January 24, 1559, at Westminster Abbey in London, England, by Owen Oglethorpe, Bishop of Carlisle. Elizabeth had a very difficult education. She was fluent in 6 languages, including Latin, Greek, French, and Italian. She was taught theology, history, philosophy, sewing, and rhetoric. Having all this knowledge, Elizabeth became a very successful ruler. But when Elizabeth became ruler of England, she had many things to deal with. Mary Tudor, her half-sister and previous rulers of England, had left the state pretty much bankrupt, and England was in need of some sort of religious mediation. She cut back on royal expenses, encouraging her court to purchase her expensive gifts such as fancy dresses and jewelry to win her affection, and to invite her to stay with them. She also cut down on inflation and reduced England's debt. Elizabeth was Protestant, and she didn't want the reputation of her older sister Mary, so she decided to set up a religious settlement known as the Elizabeth Settlement, which stated that she didn't care what men believed just as long as they attended the Church of England. She also passed the Act of Supremacy, declaring herself as supreme governor of the church rather than the supreme head. Many men were interested in Elizabeth's hand in marriage because of the fact that if she would marry a foreigner, she would have to hand England's ruling over to that country as well. For a long time, the people of England thought she would marry Robert Dudley, a childhood friend, but she never did marry him as she stayed single her whole entire life, and she took on the nicknames of Virgin Mary, Gloriana, and many others.
Elizabeth had a very unique sense of style. Behind the scenes, she preferred to wear simple gowns, and she would wear the same plain gown for 2 to 3 days. But when she was in public, she dressed to impress. The maids were meant to compliment Elizabeth's appearance, not to outshine her. In the later years of her reign, the maids wore plain-colored gowns. The queen had dresses of all colors, but white and black were her favorite colors because they symbolized virginity and purity. The queen's gowns were gorgeously hand-embroidered with a variety of colored threads and decorated with diamonds, rubies, and sapphires. In the beginning of her reign, she didn't wear a lot of makeup, but after her attack of the smallpox in 1562, she wore a lot more makeup to cover up the scars left on her face. She painted her face with white lead and vinegar, put rouge on her lips, and painted her cheeks with red dye and egg white. This makeup was very bad for her health.
Although Elizabeth was known as one of the nicest queens, she wasn't always an angel. On February 8, 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was executed by the orders of Elizabeth. The reason being Mary opposed a threat to a Catholic uprising in England. Another reason that Elizabeth had Mary executed was because many Catholics thought Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn's marriage had been illegal, which would technically make Elizabeth illegitimate to the throne, and the next legal heir was Mary. Elizabeth worked hard on political affairs, often staying up late at night writing letters and state papers. Elizabeth didn't like dealing with Parliament, and she would do anything or say anything to get her way. She thought they were a regrettable necessity. She tried to keep England out of war for most of her rule, for she saw how war could damage England and its finances from her father's overindulgence in war. Philip II had proposed to Elizabeth beforehand, and she had declined it. The only war Elizabeth ever had to deal with was the Spanish Armada when King Philip II of Spain decided to send a fleet of ships to invade England to overthrow Elizabeth and to reestablish Roman Catholicism. England had smaller and faster ships, and due to the bad weather, England came out with one of the greatest military victories in English history. Elizabeth was now known to many as Bellona, the goddess of war. The reign of Elizabeth was a great age of English exploration. English merchants wanted to buy oriental spices like cinnamon, cloves, and peppers, which they would use to add flavor and preserve meat. The merchants would get these spices from Middle Eastern middlemen, but they charged a large markup of money. Europeans wanted to establish a direct sea route to the Far East so that they could buy directly from China, India, and the East Indies. English explorers hoped to find a route by sailing northwest around America or northeast around Europe. Once they found a route to the Middle Eastern countries, trading was much easier. In the early years of Elizabeth's reign, Elizabeth was still militarily involved with Scotland and France, but then Elizabeth was eager to avoid war. Elizabeth was also eager to ensure that neither France nor Spain controlled the entire coastline facing England because threats of military invasion and trade isolation were far greater if one power controlled the entire Channel coast. At times, Elizabeth feared that the French would ally with the Dutch rebels and that they would control the whole coast. At other times, it seemed that Spain might defeat both the French and Dutch. The relationship between England and Scotland was generally good after the overthrowing of Mary, Queen of Scots. On July 6, 1586, the Treaty of Berwick formalized a mutual defense agreement between England and Scotland. Elizabeth's support from the Dutch was mostly Protestant. It angered the Spanish king Philip II. After William the Silent's assassination in 1584, the risk of Spain defeating the rebellion increased. In 1585, France fell under the control of the Catholic League. This caused Elizabeth to finally send an army to the Netherlands to secure Dutch self-rule. Wars with Spain were very expensive. The pressure on royal finances forced a sale on British lands and led Elizabeth to unpopular tools like monopolies for paying her servants. Although the cost of war was high, England's successful rebellion of Spain, which was the greatest power in Europe at the time, increased its international reputation for many years to come.
On March 6, 1603, Elizabeth was not feeling very well and she seemed depressed. She went to one of her favorite homes, the Richmond Palace. Elizabeth was very stubborn and refused to let the doctors examine her. Her condition became worse and worse as time went on, and it was obvious that the queen would pass soon. Archbishop Whitgift was ordered to come to her bedside and offer the queen a prayer. Afterwards, she fell into a deep sleep and never woke up. Queen Elizabeth died on March 6, 1603. People generally believe that she died of blood poisoning caused by the application of the white makeup ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, which was poisonous. Other possibilities included cancer or old age. The body of Queen Elizabeth was embalmed and carried in a coffin to Whitehall. The coffin was then taken to Westminster, where it stayed until the funeral. The throne of England passed on to the Protestant King James VI, who became King James I of England. And now it's time for some fun facts about Elizabeth.
Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth's mother, was accused of adultery and incest with her brother George Boleyn and was beheaded at the Tower of London.
Princess Elizabeth lived with her stepmother, Catherine Parr, and her husband, Thomas Seymour. She was sent away in disgrace from rumors that she was having an affair with Seymour.
Queen Elizabeth never actually met her cousin and rival, Mary, Queen of Scots, although she was imprisoned in England for many years.
The Elizabeth age was the era of William Shakespeare's plays.
Elizabeth reigned for 44 years and 127 days. She is the monarch with the 8th longest reign and the 3rd longest of any female monarch.
And lastly, Queen Elizabeth I has been portrayed more often in film and on television than any other British monarch.